In the summer of 1863, during the height of the Civil War, a young Union soldier by the name Samuel Walker was stationed at a military camp near Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. He had enlisted out of this sense of duty, but by that point in the war, he was getting a little bit weary. He was tired of the constant marches, the incessant sound of gunfire, and the endless days spent in the dirt and mud. It was cold, it was wet, the food sucked, it was miserable. I can totally relate. Plus, by this point, he had witnessed way too much death. If you haven't seen the movie Gettysburg or any other type of movies about the Civil War, check it out. You'll get kind of a better understanding of how medical treatment took place during that time or didn't take place. So one evening, while on patrol near the edge of the camp, Samuel and a fellow soldier named Thomas were tasked with scouting the woods that bordered the battlefield. The army was preparing for a large skirmish in the coming days, so General Meade had ordered extra precautions be taken to prevent Confederate spies from sneaking in behind Union lines. So the two men walked through the dense trees. The air was thick with the scent of pine. I've actually gone running through there, it's quite nice. Samuel noted the sound of his boots crunching in the dry leaves beneath his feet, as he and Thomas spoke in low murmurs. The eerie quiet of the forest that night made their voices sound unnaturally loud. As they moved deeper into the woods, something unsettling began to crawl under Samuel's skin. The trees sort of seemed to close in around him, casting large shadows that swayed unnaturally, even though there seemed to be no wind at all. Suddenly the air grew cold, and Samuel began to be able to see his breath in front of his face. So he murmured to Thomas, asking if he, too, noticed the sudden change in temperature. But Thomas seemed unperturbed and just continued his march. That's when they heard it. A distant sound, low and almost imperceptible, like the moan of someone in pain. At first, Samuel thought it was the wind, but it didn't sound like any wind he'd ever heard before. It was human. "Did you hear that?" Samuel whispered. His heart was beginning to race. Thomas, his comrade, nodded. "Probably just a wounded soldier. We should investigate." So they followed the sound, walking to the edge of a small clearing where the trees parted slightly. As they stepped into the clearing, they froze. In the center, lying on the ground, was a figure. A man dressed in the tattered uniform of the Confederate soldier. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes were open, staring blankly into the sky. There were bloodstains all over his uniform, and his breath came in slow, shallow, desperate gasps. But still, something seemed off about this situation to the two soldiers. They had come across lots of wounded people in the past. Maybe not out while walking in the middle of the night, but still, they knew an injured person when they saw one. His body just looked wrong. His wounds, though recent, didn't seem to match the way that a man would usually die on the battlefield. They said that his blood was almost black, and his skin was way too pale. Also, his limbs were twisted in unnatural angles, as if this were a corpse that had been moved or reanimated and twisted around by something unnatural. The air around him seemed heavier, thick with an oppressive presence. Samuel, of course, instinctively raised his rifle, but before Samuel could make a move, the man's mouth opened, and he let out a blood-curdling, low moan. His voice was warped, distorted, as if it were coming from somewhere deep within the earth. But it wasn't a plea for mercy. It was demanding something, though Samuel couldn't understand what. "Get back," Thomas hissed as he pulled Samuel away. His hand was tight on his arm. But Samuel couldn't move. He was shocked. He felt paralyzed, staring at the lifeless soldier who now seemed impossibly aware of their presence. This seemingly dead soldier then shifted his eyes and locked on to Samuel. Suddenly, the soldier's body lurched violently, as if some unforeseen force were pulling it upward. Then his mouth opened wide and released an agonizing scream that sounded as though it were made of pure suffering. This man's cry seemed to reverberate through the trees, and Samuel swears he saw shadowy figures moving in the dark corners of the clearing and making their way towards this body. But before Samuel could even react, the soldier's body collapsed back down to the earth. And in the next instant, the clearing was empty. Shadowy figures, the body, the blood, the eerie presence, all gone, as if they had never been there at all. So Thomas shouts to Samuel, "Run!" grabbing Samuel by the arm, pulling him back towards the direction of camp. So the two men sprinted through the woods as they made their way back to camp. And that night, Samuel predictably laid awake in his tent, unable to shake the image of the reanimated soldier that he had just seen. This thing with hollow eyes. He could still hear the agonizing scream echoing in his mind. And when he tried to close his eyes, he would see that guy's pale, twisted face, staring back at him. The next morning, Samuel tried to convince himself that it was all just a figment of his imagination. It was the product of exhaustion and stress and everything else that had been going on. But eventually he starts talking to the other men in the camp, as one does, and he learns something unsettling. The area where he had found the soldier with Thomas was known by the locals as the Phantom's Clearing. There had long since been stories and rumors about soldiers who had wandered into the woods only to return with tales of ghostly figures, unnatural sounds, and sightings of soldiers who had been dead for days, yet were still somehow alive, or not alive at all. Long after that incident, many soldiers reported hearing voices at night and having similar sightings of soldiers who had been dead for months on the battlefield. But the most chilling story was about a Confederate officer who had been caught and executed near that very spot. His body was never recovered. Many claimed that the officer's spirit roamed the woods, of course seeking revenge on Union soldiers. And from then on until the day he died, Samuel never returned to that part of the woods. And to this day, there are reports from visitors to the Gettysburg battlefield who say they too hear voices in the trees. Low, mournful, pleading voices that sound like they've been waiting decades to be heard.